There are certain sounds that, once you attach them to tragedy, you can never hear the same way again. A laugh, a door closing, a song on the radio. In this story, it's a whistle. It's ordinary, almost cheerful. The kind of sound you'd expect in a home where nothing is wrong, where the biggest problem is a morning rush, kid schedules, and whether someone remembered to charge their phone overnight. But later, when detectives and family members replay the footage, when every minute becomes evidence and every small choice becomes a question, that whistle doesn't feel ordinary anymore. It feels like confidence, like the sound of someone who believes they're in control. Because within days, a Colorado mother will be fighting for her life after a sudden and devastating illness. And as doctors struggled to explain what was happening, suspicion would narrow toward a place most people don't want to look. Inside the marriage, inside the home, toward the husband who looked, on paper, like the safest person in the room, a respected dentist, a father of 6, a man who knew how to present calm. And if you've ever watched a perfect life story fall apart, you know the moment I'm talking about, the moment when you realize the danger wasn't random. It was personal, it was close, and it may have been deliberate. This is the story of Angela Craig, and a husband who, prosecutors said, didn't just betray her, he tried to erase her, slowly, quietly, right in front of everyone. Angela Craig was a mother, a wife, the center of a large family, 6 kids, years of routines, and a life that, from the outside, seemed stable and grounded. Her husband, Dr. Jim Craig, was a dentist with an established practice. He had the kind of professional confidence that makes people trust you without thinking. The kind of man who can look into a camera and speak comfortably, as if the world makes sense, and he knows how to solve problems. And that matters, because in many true crime stories, especially the ones involving professionals, the case isn't just about what someone did. It's about the advantage of appearing reliable, of being the person people assume is rational, measured, and helpful. Angela and Jim had been married for more than 2 decades. But long marriage doesn't always mean healthy marriage. Behind the family life were fractures, serious ones, infidelity, mistrust, and, according to family members, an earlier incident that made Angela fear her husband was capable of drugging her, an event that, even if you only know it to the people who described it, becomes crucial to understanding what happens next. Because when Angela suddenly became ill in March of 2023, she didn't just feel sick. She felt something that cut deeper than illness. She felt unsafe. And if you're thinking, people get sick all the time, how does this become a murder investigation? Hold on to that thought, because the way this case unfolds is exactly what makes it so haunting. At first, it looks like a mystery. Then it looks like a tragedy. And then, almost all at once, it starts to look like a plan. It's Monday morning, the kind of day that feels predictable. And it begins with something healthy. Angela does a workout. But soon after, her body changes in a way that doesn't feel normal. She becomes dizzy, weak, foggy. She struggles to describe it. Like her thoughts are moving through thick syrup. She sends messages to her sister, Tony, trying to put words to something her brain won't cooperate with. She also messages her husband. And from the start, there's urgency. Not drama, urgency. She knows something is wrong. Jim leaves work and comes home. On home surveillance footage, you can see Angela barely able to walk, and him guiding her to the car. They go to the hospital. This is where the story becomes terrifying in a quiet way. Because if you've ever been in an emergency room with a loved one, you know what it feels like when medical staff can't immediately identify the problem. Tests come back without clear answers. There's no obvious explanation that fits cleanly. And that uncertainty, especially early on, can create a dangerous gap. A gap where the wrong conclusions form, where the wrong person gets believed, where the patient gets dismissed. Angela is sent home, still sick, still shaken. And later, Jim reportedly tells someone at his practice that Angela believed something was off, that she thought she'd been drugged, that she believed some substances wouldn't appear on a standard test. Now, in an ordinary marriage, that would sound like fear talking. In this marriage, given what people would later describe, that suspicion lands like a warning flare. Because Angela wasn't only fighting symptoms. She was fighting disbelief. And she was fighting the possibility that the person closest to her wasn't her protector. He was a threat. The next day, Angela confronts Jim. And it isn't just about how she feels physically. It's about what she experienced emotionally at the hospital. She felt judged, treated like she did it to herself, like her words weren't credible. She's angry, and that anger is important because it's the voice of someone who knows something is wrong and feels the world sliding away beneath her. Jim's responses are defensive in a careful way. He frames things clinically. He insists he didn't accuse her. He asked for tests because she accused him. The exchange, captured on home cameras, becomes one of those moments that investigators and viewers latch onto because it's so raw. Angela wanted advocacy. She wanted him to fight for her. Instead, she felt like he stood beside the system while it doubted her. And then you learn why that doubt was unbearable. Because, according to those close to Angela, there was history. Years earlier, their marriage had nearly collapsed after Jim admitted to an affair and said he was leaving. Angela was devastated, but tried to hold her family together. And during that period, Angela's sister would later describe an even darker incident, that Angela believed she had been sedated without her consent, an event tied to Jim's mental state and a crisis in the marriage. Whether every detail of that earlier incident is known publicly in full or not, what matters here is the psychological impact. Angela carried a fear that her husband might be capable of chemically incapacitating her. So when, in March 2023, she suddenly felt drugged, it wasn't a random accusation. It was a fear with roots, a fear that had been planted years earlier. And when Jim messages her something like, "Given our history, I understand why you feel triggered," it can sound empathetic, but it also functions like a shield. It frames her suspicion as emotional memory, not present danger. It invites people to think this is trauma talking rather than this might be real. And in cases like this, that distinction can mean life or death. Now, we need to step back because March 2023 didn't happen in a vacuum. Just months earlier, Angela had discovered something that added fresh gasoline to old fire. A profile Jim had created on a dating-style website. Not an accidental flirtation. A deliberate choice. A door into a parallel life. And it wasn't just a profile. Investigators would later speak with women who described being involved with Jim. Some for a short period, but long enough to create pressure. Angela confronted him. Jim reportedly tried to smooth it over, suggesting it wasn't what it looked like, or that it didn't mean what it clearly implied. But even in the messages between Angela and Jim from that period, the mistrust sits right at the surface. "Is there anything else you're not telling me?" That's not casual. That's the language of someone who has learned that disclosure comes in layers, one truth at a time, only after being cornered. And if you're building tension in your mind, if you're thinking, this feels like motive territory, you're not wrong. Because in many domestic homicide cases, the motive isn't rage in a single moment. It's escape. It's the desire for a different life, without the consequences of leaving. Because divorce is expensive. It's public. It's humiliating. It involves courts, custody, financial disclosure, and reputational damage. But death can look like tragedy. Death can create sympathy. Death can shift money and control. And in this case, as investigators would later allege, there were also financial pressures under the surface. So by early March 2023, the pieces on the table looked like this. A marriage under severe strain. A history of betrayal and mistrust. A wife who felt unsafe. A husband maintaining a polished image. And a sudden, unexplained illness that arrived like a switch flipping. At this point in the story, no one wants to say it out loud, but people start to think it. And sometimes, thinking is the first step toward surviving it. After the first hospital trip, there's a stretch where things appear to settle, at least on the surface. Angela drinks water. She tries to rest. She doesn't exercise. There's a moment captured where Jim expresses concern that she could pass out. It sounds like care, and maybe part of it is. But in cases like this, the most unsettling thing is that normal and abnormal sit side by side. A caring sentence can be real, while something darker is also true. Then Angela crashes again. This time, She goes back to the hospital and is admitted. Her daughter communicates that no one can figure out what's happening. And this is where the tone around Jim starts to bother people. Not because grief looks only one way. People react differently under stress, but because his energy often seems mismatched to the severity of Angela's condition. He describes her illness with a kind of intellectual detachment. As if it's a puzzle, there's a line that becomes infamous. The idea that if it weren't happening to his wife, it might almost be fun to figure out. That isn't evidence of murder, but it's evidence of something else. Emotional distance. And emotional distance is often the oxygen that makes betrayal possible. Angela's family receives updates. They hear about crashes, doctors struggling to stabilize her, moments where things swing wildly. And in the middle of this, Jim makes a statement that sets off alarms. He tells Angela's sister that if Angela dies, he won't allow an autopsy. Think about what an autopsy represents in a sudden, unexplained medical crisis. It represents truth, or at least the best attempt at truth. Trying to prevent that before someone has even died sounds like a person who's thinking ahead, a person who's trying to control the story that comes after the last breath. That's not how innocent fear usually speaks. That's how containment speaks. Angela improves enough to be sent home again, but this doesn't feel like relief to her family. It feels like exposure, because the question hanging over everything is this: what if something is happening at home? So Angela's brother Mark and his wife come to town to help watch over her. This becomes one of those crucial shifts in the timeline, because now there are witnesses in the house. People who aren't in the couple's private dynamic. People who can notice if something feels wrong. Jim goes to work. Before he leaves, there's an insistence. Make sure she takes her meds. Again, on its face, this is a normal instruction. Many sick people need medications. But it becomes ominous when placed next to what prosecutors would later allege about how Angela's condition worsened over time. Not long after, Angela deteriorates rapidly. Mark and his wife rush her to the hospital. On home surveillance footage, this moment reads like the last chapter of normal life. Angela leaving her home, surrounded by family, on her way back to the same place that still can't fully explain what's happening to her. At the hospital, Jim arrives. He stays briefly. He leaves again. There's a phone call with Angela's sister, where she's shocked he isn't there. And then, within a tight window, Angela crashes in a catastrophic way. Doctors flood the room. There's a desperate effort to stabilize her. Family members receive fragmented, terrifying updates. Seizure activity, airway issues, rapid decline. Angela is placed on life support, and because she is an organ donor, her body is sustained in the ICU while her brain shows no meaningful recovery. This is where medical mystery turns into possible crime. Because now the question isn't just, what is happening? It's, who is doing this? There's a person in this story who, in many ways, becomes a hinge between suspicions and investigation. Someone inside Jim's professional world. Someone who knows what does and doesn't belong in a dental office. And that person notices something. A package delivered to practice. The details matter because they're so mundane. Office mail, a box, a packing slip, and then suddenly not mundane at all. A label indicating a lethal substance. Something not used in dentistry. Something that makes a normal person's stomach drop. The office staff member looks up symptoms associated with poisoning and recognizes a disturbing overlap with what Angela has been experiencing. This isn't courtroom proof on its own, but it's enough to trigger action. The managing partners at the practice are told. One of them goes to hospital staff with a careful message. Not an accusation, just a warning and a question. Is there anything that could be done? Is there anything they should test for? Is there anything that could reverse what's happening? Hospital staff contact law enforcement. A mandated report is made. And from that moment forward, the case begins to move like a criminal investigation. Not a tragedy. Not a confusing illness. A homicide probe. Jim begins to sense something is changing. He calls, probing, asking if anyone said anything. He offers an explanation for the package that doesn't hold up under scrutiny. And when confronted with the substance name, he reportedly pivots to a new explanation, one he will continue to suggest later. That Angela asked for it. That Angela wanted it. that he bought it for her, not to harm her, but as part of her own plan. It's a story that tries to do two things at once: explain the purchase, redirect blame. And here's what makes that kind of story powerful in the mind of a manipulative person. It doesn't have to be believed completely. It only has to create doubt, because doubt buys time, and time is leverage. Police contact Jim. They want to talk. At this stage, he is cautious. He says he's scared. He says he has information, but he doesn't want to speak without an attorney. That alone isn't suspicious. People have rights, and using them doesn't equal guilt. But the emotional framing matters. Jim presents himself as someone who holds the key to making it make sense. A man with answers. And later, when detectives serve search warrants for devices, phones, laptops, Jim asks the question many suspects ask: am I a suspect? And detectives answer in the only honest way they can in an early investigation. There are questions. We're treating this as potentially criminal until we know otherwise. Jim says he doesn't want to be handcuffed in front of his kids while preparing for a funeral. It's a human fear. It's also a calculated image, the idea of him as a decent father being publicly humiliated, and it subtly pushes the listener towards sympathy. This is a common dynamic in high-stakes cases. A person under suspicion tries to anchor themselves to identity: parent, provider, professional, because identity is emotionally persuasive. But in the background, law enforcement is doing what they always do. They're building a timeline. Because in poisoning cases, timelines are everything. What happened before symptoms? Who had access? Who benefited? What was purchased? What was searched online? What communications took place? And while detectives move through those steps, Angela's family begins experiencing something else. Something deeply unsettling. Jim's social behavior doesn't match grief. He tells odd jokes, says things that strike family members as cold, inappropriate, or even cruel. In isolation, one awkward joke means nothing. In context, it becomes a pattern. And patterns are what investigations feed on. After Angela is taken off life support and dies, detectives arrange with Jim to meet them under a pretext. Something simple, something that doesn't raise alarms. Then they arrest him. The moment is abrupt. The tone shifts from polite to procedural. Jim reacts with surprise. He insists he didn't expect it. And then, in the post-arrest interaction, he does something that becomes one of the most shocking statements in the case. He suggests the person responsible is Angela. He frames it like she asked him to buy a deadly substance, that she intended to harm herself, that he didn't think she'd do it, that it was, in his mind, a kind of standoff, an emotional game with fatal stakes. To investigators, that statement isn't just shocking, it's revealing, because it's an attempt to shift the narrative from husband kills wife to wife self-harms and husband is tragically entangled. And if that were true, detectives would expect to find supporting evidence, clear messages, credible witness statements, consistent behavior, and narrative that matches a medical course. But the people who knew Angela, family and friends, respond with disbelief. They describe her as someone who wouldn't choose a prolonged, terrifying decline. They reject the idea that she orchestrated her own suffering. And as detectives continue pulling threads, they begin to look beyond the home and into Jim's communications with other women. Because if a person is lying in one area, they're often lying in others. And lies create pressure. Pressure creates motive. Investigators speak with a woman Jim met at a dental meeting in Las Vegas, an orthodontist from Texas, often referenced publicly as Karen. They've seen communications. They know there was an emotional connection. They also notice travel details that appear to overlap with Angela's hospitalizations. Karen says she came to Denver to see Jim, but disputes some of the overlap implications. She describes the relationship as new, fast-moving emotionally, and complicated. Investigators press on what Jim told her about his marriage. Karen says Jim claimed he was already in divorce discussions, that paperwork had been filed, that the marriage was essentially ending. And then Karen mentioned something else Jim told her, something that aligns disturbingly with his later claims, that he worried Angela might hurt herself, that there was history, that there was risk. From a purely investigative standpoint, this is important because it suggests preloading. If Jim anticipated suspicion, planting the idea of Angela's self-harm potential in someone else's mind could serve as a future narrative shield. In other words, if something happens, you'll understand why. Detectives tell Karen a blunt version of reality, that many of the things she was told appear inconsistent with what Angela's family knows and with what investigators are seeing. Karen appears shaken. And here's a key point for the psychology of this case. Karen isn't framed as a villain in the story. She's framed as a person who may have been misled, pulled into a carefully managed version of Jim, because that's what manipulative people often do. They don't just lie to one person. They run different realities for different audiences. One story for the spouse, one story for the new romantic interest, one story for coworkers, one story for law enforcement. And the hope is that the contradictions never line up in the same room. But in a homicide investigation, contradictions always line up. A question detectives and prosecutors often ask in domestic homicide cases is simple. What changed? What pressure was rising? What did the suspect stand to gain or lose? In this case, there were discussions of financial strain and professional pressure. Business partners described helping with significant financial problems, including past bankruptcy-related burdens. At the same time, evidence suggested spending continued, travel, gifts, and financial arrangements with other women. And then there's life insurance. Public reporting around the case described insurance policies where Jim was a beneficiary, and prosecutors argued that these policies formed part of motive. Money alone doesn't prove murder, but money can make a terrible idea feel solvable to someone who thinks in transactions. If divorce threatens your finances, your reputation, your custody position, your community standing, then a person with the wrong moral wiring might decide there's a cleaner exit, not a lawful exit, a final one. And in this story, the image of Jim as a respected dentist matters again, because for someone who is deeply invested in reputation, divorce is public failure, but being a grieving widower, that can look like tragedy, that can generate sympathy, that can keep you socially intact, at least temporarily. This is how people talk themselves into the unforgivable. They don't start with murder. They start with a fantasy of escape. Investigators examine devices. And in many modern cases, the digital trail becomes the spine of the timeline. Searches, purchases, deliveries, emails, notes and memos, location data, surveillance video. Public reporting described investigators finding evidence suggesting Jim researched lethal substances and their detectability. I'm not going to repeat specific search phrases or details because that kind of content can be misused. But the broader point is this. Investigators believe they were looking at intentional preparation, not random curiosity. They also looked at delivery patterns, packages arriving when Angela was away, or when timing would reduce the chance of discovery. They looked at surveillance footage of mail pickup. They looked at late-night trips and purchases of items that, while ordinary in other contexts, became alarming in this one, and prosecutors would later present a narrative of escalation, an alleged sequence where earlier attempts did not produce the intended result, leading to additional actions. That's one of the most frightening aspects of alleged poisoning cases. They can involve adjustment, iteration, a person learning from outcomes, not in a laboratory sense, but in a human sense, watching what happens to the victim, then changing strategy. That's why the slow part of the story matters so much. Angela wasn't taken quickly. She suffered in waves, and the people around her were stuck in uncertainty while the danger, prosecutors argued, remained active. There's a period in the timeline that becomes especially haunting, the final hospital day. Public reporting described investigators focusing on Jim's movements in and out of Angela's room in a narrow time frame preceding her catastrophic decline. Prosecutors later alleged that a final act occurred at the hospital. This is one of those details that makes people's stomachs turn, not because hospitals are unsafe by nature, but because hospitals represent help, oversight, and care. They're where families go to be protected from the unknown. So the idea that danger could follow you there feels like a violation of the last safe place. Hospital surveillance footage reportedly captured Jim in the area, and the timing became a key investigative focus. From a documentary standpoint, this is where you feel the emotional weight for Angela's family the most. They thought they had handed her into the safest possible system. But if prosecutors were right, safety wasn't enough, because the threat had access, familiarity, and confidence. Some cases end emotionally with an arrest. This one doesn't, because after Jim was jailed, prosecutors allege a series of attempts to manipulate the case, trying to recruit others to support a narrative, seeking fabricated or misleading evidence, encouraging false testimony, and, most disturbingly, an alleged effort involving deepfake-style fabrication. These allegations mattered because they didn't just suggest panic, they suggested intent to obstruct, to control the story after the fact. And prosecutors also alleged solicitation related to harming a lead investigator, an escalation that, if true, paints a portrait of someone who views people not as humans, but as obstacles. This is where the psychological profile sharpens. A person who cannot tolerate losing. A person who tries to force reality to obey. Even when reality is a courtroom, and the stakes are life in prison. At trial, the case became a contest between narratives. The prosecution story, as publicly reported, was one of deliberate action. A husband seeking escape through poisoning, supported by digital evidence, purchases, timing, and alleged behavior before and after Angela's decline. The defense story centered on the claim that Angela wanted to end her own life and asked Jim to obtain lethal substances, an explanation that aimed to reframe suspicious purchases as tragic compliance rather than malicious intent. Juries are asked to decide which story fits the evidence, not which story is emotionally easier. And in this case, public reporting states the jury rejected the defense explanation. Jim Craig was found guilty on charges, including first-degree murder after deliberation, along with additional counts related to evidence and solicitation. Later, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, Angela's sister delivered a statement that, like many victim impact statements, was not about vengeance. It was about reality, about who Angela was, about the loss, and about the fact that the light Angela brought into the world didn't belong to the person who destroyed her. It belonged to the people who loved her and to the children left behind. If you're looking for one neat moral from this story, you won't find it. Because the scariest part of cases like this is that they don't begin with monsters and masks. They begin with normal days, with spouses who look fine, with routines, with trusted professions and friendly conversations. The danger is disguised as familiarity. And that's why Angela's early instinct, "I feel drugged," matters so much. Because she tried to name what her body already knew. She tried to speak truth while the world still had time to respond. This story also shows how complicated medical mysteries can become when there's deception in the room. Doctors treat symptoms. Investigators treat patterns. Families are forced to live in the gap between the two, hoping for answers, fearing the worst, and watching someone they love disappear in slow motion. And finally, it shows something even more disturbing. For some people, the real addiction isn't money or romance. It's control. Control over how they're seen. Control over the narrative. Control over outcomes. Even after someone dies. Even after the police arrive. Even after a jury speaks. They still want to control the story. But here's the thing about cameras, records, and timelines. They don't care about charm. They don't care about reputation. They don't care how convincing you sound when you say, "This will make sense later." They only care about what happened. And in this case, the story ended with conviction. Angela was 43, and 6 children were left to grow up carrying a loss that didn't have to exist. So when you think back to that whistle, the casual sound at the start, maybe that's a final haunting detail. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying people don't look terrified at all. They look comfortable. They look normal. They look like they belong in your home.